Hi, I'm Pastor Allen. Today is Tuesday, May 19th, and today we have a short devotion on what to do when you find yourself in the wilderness. Hagar was Sarah's servant or maidservant, and a conflict developed between her, Sarah, and Hagar. And the reason for the conflict was mostly Sarah's doing and a little bit of Abraham's doing. See, Sarah and Abraham had a promise from God that they would have a son. But they tried to rush out in front of God. They tried to make things happen in their own time, in their own way, rather than waiting on God. And so they rushed out ahead of God, and they did it at Sarah's insistence to have a promised son. And so Sarah said, well, why don't you sleep with Hagar, and Hagar could bear your son instead of me, since I'm unable to have children. Well, Hagar became pregnant. Sarah became jealous, and she began to mistreat Hagar because Hagar had something that Sarah did not have and could not have. And so Hagar, after being mistreated, she ran away out into the wilderness alone, afraid. The Bible tells us that she met God there. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 13, it says, so she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roi, for she said, in this place have I actually seen the one that sees me. And El Roi means the God who sees me. And here is Hagar all alone at the end of her wits in the wilderness, and God meets her there. See, it's in the wilderness when we feel most alone, when we feel death or dying. And the wilderness can be a place where God meets us. Hagar was totally on her own, or so she thought. God was with her, though. None of us is ever alone, even though we might think we are, even though we might be discouraged, even though we might not understand totally what's going on. God does not leave us alone. And so God was with her. He honored the promise that he made to Abraham about a son. And so from Hagar, we learn the simple lesson that God is a God who sees us. That no matter where we are, no matter how abandoned we feel, no matter how we may feel in life, no matter the circumstances, God is a God that sees us. The other time in the Bible is when the Israelites fled the Egyptian slavery. And they went on the journey and they ended up in the wilderness. And Moses was with them. Moses was leading them and he was guiding them and he was instructing them about God, but the people rebelled. They refused to listen to Moses, their leader, and they claimed that God had abandoned them in the wilderness so that they could die there. In Numbers chapter 20, verse 4, it says, why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Well, God did nothing of the sort. And how the Israelites ended up in the wilderness was their own making. But God was with them. All they had to do was look to God and listen to God. But instead, the Israelites felt that they were going to die, that they did not have enough supplies, that God and Moses were inadequate to the task of leading them and protecting them. Now, Moses probably was, because he was human. But as long as Moses followed God, God was more than enough. And so when the Israelites were delivered from slavery in Egypt, it was the wilderness wandering that tested them, that refocused them to look to God. They were provided for. God gave them everything that they needed. Their supplies were limited. You know, the whole story, if you want to read it, is in Exodus chapter 15 and Exodus chapter 16. You know, they had limited supplies. They were uncertain about what the next day would bring, what the next step would bring. It sort of sounds similar to our own situation we find ourselves in today. See, we've been living in a time where the things that have brought us comfort, the things that we knew as normal, the things that we held on to as a sure foundation, those things have been taken away, or they've been extremely limited. We all thought we had control. We thought we had everything the way we wanted it to be and the way that it would be in the future. We all thought we were in control of our lives. We thought we were in control of our work and our freedom, but you know what? That was and is just an illusion. It's smoke and mirrors, it's a vapor, it's not reality. See, we really have nothing without God. And so now we have an opportunity. God has given us a chance to reboot things, to reboot the routines of our lives, to reboot the way that we live, the way that we interact with each other. And most of all, God has given us a chance to get to know Him better. See, God used His power for people to believe and follow Him. He used it in the wilderness for the Israelites, and He uses it for us today. And just as God led the Israelites with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud of smoke during the day so that they knew God's presence was with them, all we need to do is look up and we will see God's presence with us. In the New Testament, Jesus was brought up on a high mountain and He was tempted by Satan. Satan said, "Worship me and I will give you all the powers, I will give you all the kingdoms, I will give you everything if you bow down and worship me." But that's not how we obtain power. Jesus already had power because He was one with the Father. And He did the Father's will, and He prayed and stayed in communication with the Father. And eventually all things would be given to Him by the Father as long as He followed the Father, looked to the Father, and worshiped the Father. And it's the same thing for us. We need to look to the Father. See, we don't achieve things without loss. The temptation of Jesus is the same temptation that we face. It's an opportunity to bypass suffering, to bypass the hard parts of life, to bypass being in the wilderness and feeling alone. But life doesn't work that way. See, we do not get the good or the best without pain. And so when we feel depressed and powerless at the current pandemic unfolding day by day, we can choose to rest in Jesus. Why? Because Jesus, as it says in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the Lord Himself will give you the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Jesus is our Emmanuel. Jesus is our God, the God with us. And so the Bible tells us, whether we find ourselves like Hagar in the wilderness, the Israelites in the wilderness, or Jesus up on a mountain being tempted by Satan and undergoing a difficult time, the Bible tells us that God is with us, no matter the circumstances. And like Hagar learned, God is the God who sees us all the time, who watches over us all the time. and most of all, loves us all the time. Amen. Have a great Tuesday.